there is a town in southern Bavaria. It sits roughly 16 kilometers northwest of Munich, close enough that, on a clear morning, you can see the spires of the city from the surrounding hills. The town has a name. It is called Dachau, and for most of its long history, before the 20th century turned dark, it was known for something gentle, for the quality of its light. Painters came here, artists set up studios. The way the afternoon sun fell across the marshlands and the old town rooftops made it one of the most painted landscapes in 19th century Germany. People came to Dachau to create. Then, in the late winter of 1933, something else arrived. It came not with fanfare or proclamation, but with the quiet bureaucratic efficiency that would become one of the defining signatures of the Nazi state. A disused munitions factory on the northeastern edge of the town was quietly assessed, then requisitioned, then transformed. Within days, it had a new name, a new function, and a new kind of population. It became a concentration camp. The first one, the original template, the place from which all the others would take their form. I want to be honest with you at the start of this documentary. What you are about to hear over the next several hours is not easy history. It is not the kind of history that resolves neatly into lessons with clean edges. Dachau operated from the 22nd of March, 1933, to the 29th of April, 1945. Almost the entire lifespan of the Third Reich. More than 200,000 human beings passed through its gates. At least 40,000 died there. Some historians believe the true number was considerably higher. This film is not about ideology. It is not here to explain or justify what any political movement believed. It is a historical record, a careful, documented account of what was built, how it operated, who ran it, who suffered in it, and what ultimately became of it. I have organized this documentary the way a researcher organizes a file. Chronologically, methodically, and with respect for the complexity of the evidence. Where historians disagree, I will tell you. Where the records are incomplete, I will say so. I owe you that much. If you find this kind of long-form documentary history valuable, the kind that sits with a subject rather than rushing past it, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. This channel exists because of viewers who believe that slow, careful, human history still matters. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1, the town before the camp long, before the name Dachau, became a word that people said in a certain tone, quietly, carefully, with weight. It was simply a town, a market town, an old settlement, established in the foothills of Bavaria, positioned where the Amper River flows through flat land toward Munich. It had been a town for centuries before any of this happened. What I find worth noting, and what the historical literature on this period sometimes underweights, is that the choice of Dachau as the site for Germany's first concentration camp was not random. It was practical, logistical, and deeply deliberate. The site selected for the camp was a munitions complex, a former factory that had served Germany during the First World War and had been sitting largely idle since the armistice of 1918. It was large, fenced, and already divided into functional sections. It had existing infrastructure, electrical lines, drainage, some administrative buildings. It was close to Munich, which mattered because Munich was the heart of National Socialism's political geography. The Nazis called Munich the Hauptstadt der Bewegung, the capital of the movement. Having the first camp within easy reach of that city was not coincidental. Heinrich Himmler, at this point the police president of Munich, and already a man of considerable and growing influence within the SS, personally oversaw the inspection of the Dachau site in mid-March of 1933. He had been looking for a location to house what the Nazi state was already calling political prisoners. The communists, social democrats, trade union officials, and other opponents who had been swept up in the frenzy of arrests that followed the Reichstag fire in late February of that year. The jails were filling up. Something more permanent was needed. The town of Dachau itself, the civilians, the shopkeepers, the farmers, the families, did not resist this development, at least not in any organized, documented way. This is one of those historiographical points that scholars continue to examine with difficulty. Proximity does not equal complicity, but it also cannot be separated entirely from the moral weight of what occurred just beyond the town's eastern edge. The camp was not hidden. It was not built in a remote forest. It stood adjacent to a community that went about its daily life for 12 years, while, a short distance away, the first machinery of the concentrationary system operated. On the 22nd of March, 1933, the first prisoner transports arrived. Those initial detainees were primarily political opponents, members of the Social Democratic Party, officials of trade unions, Communist Party functionaries, journalists who had written critically of the new government, lawyers who had defended the wrong clients. In the political logic of the new Nazi state, these were not prisoners in the traditional sense. They had not been convicted of crimes by courts. They were held under what the regime termed Schutzhaft, protective custody, a legal fiction that allowed the state to imprison individuals indefinitely without trial, without charge, and without any fixed date of release. The first commandant of Dachau was a man named Hilmar Wekeler, a longtime associate of Himmler. His tenure was brief and chaotic. Within the first months of operation, several prisoners were killed on his watch. The deaths drew scrutiny, not from any organized resistance, but from Bavarian judicial authorities, who were still, in this earliest period of the Nazi regime, operating with some residual legal independence. A Munich prosecutor actually opened inquiries. It was a moment of institutional friction that, in another political environment, might have grown into something consequential. It did not. Himmler removed Wekeler, shut down the legal proceedings, and made a different appointment. He chose a man named Theodor Eicke. That choice changed everything, not just at Dachau, but across the entire landscape of what the concentration camp system would become. Eicke was 40 years old, a former army paymaster, a dedicated National Socialist, and a man of considerable organizational ability, paired with almost complete moral indifference to human suffering. He arrived at Dachau in June of 1933. Within months, he had fundamentally restructured the camp. Scholar Harold Marcuse, one of the most thorough historians of Dachau's long record, describes Eicke as a fanatically dedicated Nazi and a gifted organizer, as well as a stubborn, ruthless, and brutal man. That combination of qualities made him, from the regime's perspective, the ideal architect. What Eicke built at Dachau was not improvised cruelty. It was a system, a bureaucratic, codified, administratively organized system for the management, control, and dehumanization of human beings. In October of 1933, he issued a formal document, the camp's regulations, titled Maintenance of Discipline and Order, which laid out in precise detail the hierarchy of command, the structure of punishment, and the range of offences that could bring those punishments down upon a prisoner. The document was written in the dry, procedural language of institutional administration. That, in itself, is historically significant. The horror was not spontaneous. It was designed. The early capacity of the camp was set at roughly 5,000 prisoners. In its first year, the population fluctuated well below that figure, but it grew steadily as the Nazi regime consolidated power and expanded its definition of who constituted a threat to the state. Political opponents remained the core population through 1933 and into 1934. But already, within this first year, the contours of a much broader system of persecution were becoming visible. Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to renounce their faith, men arrested under paragraph 175 of the Criminal Code for homosexuality, individuals categorized as asocial, a term the Nazi bureaucracy applied with sweeping, arbitrary flexibility. What is perhaps hardest to fully absorb from the distance of nearly a century is how quickly all of this happened. Germany, in the autumn of 1932, was a functioning democracy with courts, newspapers, political parties, and legal protections. By the autumn of 1933, one of those courts was trying to investigate murders at a concentration camp and finding itself blocked by political authority. Dachau was not the end of something. It was the beginning. And in this first chapter of its history, when the machinery was still new and the regulations still being written, what was being constructed here was a template, not just for the 140 subcamps that would eventually orbit Dachau itself, but for the entire architecture of terror that would define the next 12 years of European history. Chapter 2, The Architect of the System, Theodor Eicke, and the Dachau Rules. Let me tell you something about the way organizational systems spread. Once a system is proven to work, once it produces reliable, predictable results within the terms of its own stated objectives, institutions copy it, they replicate it, they adapt its structures and impose them on new environments. This is true in business, in militaries, and it turns out in concentration camps. The system Theodor Eicke built at Dachau between 1933 and 1934 became the administrative DNA of the entire Nazi concentration camp network. Understanding it is not optional if you want to understand what followed. Eicke's central innovation at Dachau was not any particular act of cruelty, though cruelty was an instrument he deployed with bureaucratic regularity. His real innovation was the codification of cruelty, its translation from impulse into procedure. Before Eicke, the early camps run by the SA and even some SS units were chaotic, violent, and idiosyncratic. Different guards did different things. Punishments were arbitrary. Records were inconsistent. Eicke looked at this chaos and found it inefficient. What he created in its place was a formal hierarchy of control that specified, in writing, exactly what each rank within the camp could decide, exactly what offences merited which punishments, and exactly how those punishments were to be carried out. His October 1933 regulations, the maintenance of discipline and order, invested supreme authority in the camp commandant. Below the commandant sat a rank structure of SS officers and block leaders, each with defined responsibilities and defined limits. Eicke was not simply building a camp. He was building an institution with all the self-reinforcing logic that institutions carry. Punishments in his system ranged from loss of male privileges and hard labor, through solitary confinement on bread and water, to corporal punishment administered publicly. Public administration was deliberate. The entire prisoner population was to observe. The goal, stated plainly in Eicke's own language, was intimidation. What is historically striking about the October 1933 regulations is the list of offences for which Eicke specified the death penalty. Political agitation among prisoners, spreading of unauthorized information, incitement to mutiny, attempted escape, and attacking a guard. What is equally striking is who was exempted from any real oversight in applying these punishments. The answer, of course, was the commandant himself. Eicke had constructed a system where his own authority was effectively unchecked, legitimized by the bureaucratic language of the document itself. Historian Charles Sidnor, in his detailed study of the SS Death's Head formations, delineated these rules with precision, and his analysis remains one of the most useful frameworks for understanding how Dachau's regulations functioned in practice. Rudolf Höss, who would later, to history's lasting horror, become commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau, served at Dachau under Eicke's system. He was not a senior figure during his time there, but he was a student of everything he observed. In testimony given years later, when he was facing justice in Poland, Höss described a flogging he witnessed at Dachau. The precision of his account is itself a form of historical evidence. The U-shaped formation of SS men with weapons, the punishment bench in the center, the two block leaders alternating blows, the camp commandant present to observe. This was not the improvised brutality of uncontrolled men. It was administered, witnessed, formalized. It was meant to be seen. Ike also understood something that many administrators miss: that institutions reproduce themselves through their personnel, not just their paperwork. He was intensely focused on the indoctrination of the SS men who served under him. He trained them to see the prisoners not as individuals, not as fellow Germans or human beings with histories and families, but as categorically different, as enemies, as threats, as something requiring containment. He used the language of the camp as a military assignment, telling his guards that they were the only soldiers in peacetime facing the enemy day and night, the enemy behind the barbed wire. This framing, absurd on its face, was effective precisely because it gave the guards a narrative in which their participation was not persecution but service. In May of 1934, Himmler promoted Ike to SS Brigadeführer and assigned him to prepare for the role of Inspector of Concentration Camps, a newly created position that would not become official until early July of that year. Before Ike formally assumed that role, Himmler gave him another assignment, one that reveals the extent to which loyalty and personal violence had become institutional currency in the Nazi state. During the Night of the Long Knives, the purge of late June and early July 1934, in which the SS moved against the leadership of the SA, Ike personally carried out the execution of Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA. He had first offered Röhm the chance to take his own life. Röhm refused. Ike entered the cell and did it himself. Once established as inspector, Ike's influence became systemic in the most literal sense. He traveled to each of the existing camps and imposed the Dachau regulations on them. SS guards in these camps began receiving standardized pay as full-time employees, a change that professionalized their service and bound them more formally to the institution. In 1936, Ike redesignated the camp guard units as Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head formations, the name drawn from the skull insignia already worn on their collars. The name was not accidental. It was a statement about identity, about the work these men understood themselves to be doing. The camps that followed Dachau, Sachsenhausen, established near Berlin in 1936, Buchenwald near Weimar in 1937, and others across the expanding Reich, were not invented independently. Their administrative structures, their internal hierarchies, their punishment registers, their guard training programs, all of these traced back, document by document and regulation by regulation, to what Ike had codified at Dachau in the autumn of 1933. This is what historians mean when they call Dachau the model camp. The designation is not metaphorical, it is structural. The camp's very organizational DNA was replicated across an entire system. There is something I want to sit with for a moment before moving on, because the scholarly literature on Eck and the camp system tends, understandably, to focus on his administrative effectiveness. But there is a human cost to administrative effectiveness deployed in this direction that we should not pass over too quickly. Every camp built on the Dachau model was a place where tens of thousands of human beings were imprisoned without trial, subjected to systematic degradation, and in many cases, killed. Ike did not build these things because he was uniquely monstrous in any spontaneous, uncontrollable way. He built them because he was organized, dedicated, and operating within a political structure that rewarded exactly what he offered. That is, in its own terrible way, one of the most important lessons this history offers. Chapter 3, Inside the Gates. The architecture of control stand at the entrance of Dachau as it exists today as a memorial site, and you will see, wrought in metal above the main gate, a phrase, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. It is a lie, of course, though it was not stated as one. It was stated as a principle, a governing fiction that framed incarceration and forced labor within the pseudo-moral language of the regime. The sign would later appear at other camps, most infamously at Auschwitz. But it originated here, at this gate, in this town on the northwestern edge of Munich. Its presence here was not merely decorative. It was the regime's explanation of itself to itself. The physical layout of Dachau, as it was rebuilt and expanded between 1937 and 1938 using prisoner labor, was not accidental in its design. The camp was divided into two primary sections, the prisoner compound and the administrative and service area. The prisoner compound contained 32 barracks, arranged in a precise rectangular grid on either side of a wide central avenue, the Lagerstrasse, along which prisoners were marched to roll call, to work assignments, to punishment details, and, in too many cases, to their deaths. This grid layout was functional. It allowed for surveillance, for rapid assembly, for the kind of total visual control that the SS required. Surrounding the prisoner compound was a carefully engineered barrier system. An electrified barbed wire fence was the innermost perimeter. Beyond that ran a drainage ditch, part moat, part boundary marker. And beyond that, a wall with 7-guard towers positioned at intervals that provided overlapping fields of observation. The electrified fence was not merely an obstacle. It became, over the course of the camp's operation, a site of specific horror, because some prisoners, driven to the limit of what they could endure, ran deliberately into it. The guards called this going to the wire. Camp administration recorded these deaths as suicides. The historiographical debate around how to categorize them as suicides, as executions provoked by systematic torment, remains unresolved and is not one I intend to resolve here. At the camp entrance stood the Jura House, the gatehouse, which served as the administrative center and the point of entry and exit for all prisoners. This building controlled the transition between the outside world and the world of the camp. Once a prisoner passed through its gates, the ordinary categories of civic existence, name, profession, family, legal status, were not exactly erased, but they were suspended. Prisoners received numbers. They wore uniforms with a system of colored triangular badges that identified their category of imprisonment. Red for political prisoners, black for asocials, pink for men imprisoned under paragraph 175, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on. The categorization was meticulous. It enabled administration. It also, deliberately, stripped away individuality. The barracks themselves were initially wooden structures built for capacity rather than comfort. Each barracks block was designed to house roughly 200 men, but as the camp population grew, particularly during the war years, these figures became grotesquely inadequate to the actual numbers crammed within them. Sanitary facilities were chronically insufficient relative to population. The camp had a kitchen, laundry facilities, and a shower block, but access to these was regulated, rationed, and used as both necessity and instrument of control. Cold, hunger, exhaustion, and illness were not accidental features of the prisoner's existence. They were, in the logic of the system, management tools. One barracks block within the prisoner compound was set aside exclusively for clergy, priests, pastors, and men of religious vocation who had been imprisoned for opposition to or conflict with the Nazi state. This is a detail that the historical record preserves with some specificity. More than 2,600 clergymen from across occupied Europe would pass through Dachau over the course of its operation. The majority of them Catholic priests from Poland. Their presence in a dedicated block reflects both the scale of the regime's conflict with religious institutions and the camp's extraordinary reach across conquered Europe. They were there from nearly every occupied country, a separate and deeply important structure, though I want to approach it carefully, was a building set aside for medical activity. I will discuss the specific nature of what occurred in that building in a later chapter. For now, it is enough to note its presence within the camp's architectural plan. Its existence tells us something important, that by the time the rebuilt camp opened in the summer of 1938, the use of prisoners' bodies for non-consensual experimentation was already anticipated and planned for. The building was not improvised after the fact. It was included in the original construction. This is one of those historical details that, once you encounter it, refuses to become neutral. The camp's administrative buildings stood separately from the prisoner compound. Offices for the commandant, the SS Guard leadership, the record-keeping functions that generated the staggering volumes of documentation that would eventually become crucial evidence at post-war trials. The Nazis were, in this regard, remarkably thorough in their paperwork. Prisoner registrations, punishment records, medical entries, death certificates. Much of this documentation survived, either because the staff fled too quickly to destroy it, or because the scope of the administrative record was simply too vast to eliminate in the time available. This archival survival is both a historical blessing and a historical responsibility, because it means that what happened at Dachau can be documented with unusual precision. The roll call square, the Appelplatz, deserves particular attention as a spatial and psychological feature of the camp. Roll call happened twice daily, morning and evening. All prisoners were required to stand in ranked formation, while SS guards counted them. If the numbers did not match, if someone was unaccounted for, the roll call continued, for hours if necessary. In winter, in the kind of cold that the Bavarian plateau generates with indifferent efficiency, prisoners in thin uniforms stood on an open square, while guards recounted, rechecked, and sometimes used the extended duration as its own form of punishment. The Appelplatz was where the camp displayed its authority most visibly and most physically. It was the place where the daily arithmetic of control was performed in public. By the time the rebuilt, expanded Dachau opened officially in mid-August of 1938, the camp had capacity for up to 6,000 men. It had a physical form that would remain essentially unchanged for the rest of its operational life. It had a documented set of administrative procedures. It had a trained cadre of SS guards who had internalized, to varying degrees, the institutional identity Ike had constructed. It was, in every functional sense of the word, a mature institution, one that had moved beyond improvisation into the settled procedural rhythms of ongoing operation. And it was still, at this point in the summer of 1938, operating almost exclusively on German soil, with a prisoner population that was still primarily German. That was about to change. Chapter 4, The Prisoner Arrival, Categorization, and Daily Existence. I want to try, in this chapter, to trace the experience of a single human being arriving at Dachau. Not a composite character, not an invented figure, but the general arc of experience documented across hundreds of survived testimonies and the extensive post-war literature on the camp. I will not invent a name or manufacture a specific biography, but the broad sequence of what arrival meant, what the first days were like, and what daily existence in the camp consisted of. This is documented with considerable specificity, and it deserves to be described clearly, without either sanitization or gratuitous emphasis on suffering. Arrival at Dachau typically began with a journey. For prisoners in the early years, the political detainees of 1933 and 1934, that journey was often a short one. A truck or a train from a Munich police facility, a matter of hours. For later prisoners, particularly those swept in during the war years, from occupied Poland, France, the Soviet Union, and across Europe, the journey could be days or weeks in conditions that were themselves a kind of pre-camp ordeal. By the time many of these men and women reached Dachau, they were already weakened, disoriented, and uncertain of what awaited them. The uncertainty was not incidental. It was leveraged. Upon entering the camp, new arrivals underwent a processing sequence that was, by the late 1930s, formalized and efficient. Personal belongings were confiscated and catalogued. Money, watches, photographs, letters, all of it taken and placed in storage that, for many prisoners, they would never retrieve. Hair was shaved. Camp uniforms were issued, striped fabric, thin, inadequate for the Bavarian winters. A number was assigned. The colored badge denoting the prisoner's category, political, religious, racial, criminal, was stitched onto the uniform. From the moment of this processing, the prisoner existed within the camp system as a number and a category. The SS guards were instructed, and in time culturally conditioned, to engage with prisoners on exactly those terms. The daily schedule at Dachau was structured with the rigid, exhausting predictability that Eicher's regulations demanded. Prisoners rose in the early morning hours. The precise time varied by season, but it was consistently before dawn. They were allowed a limited period to make their bunks, wash, and attend to basic sanitary needs before the first roll call of the day. The standards to which bunk making was held were, deliberately, nearly impossible to meet perfectly. The consequences of imperfect bunk making, punishment details, reduced rations, formal punishment, were not about maintaining order in any practical sense. They were about maintaining a state of constant, low-level anxiety in the prisoner population, a permanent condition of potential failure and potential punishment that consumed psychological resources and prevented the accumulation of any real sense of security. Work occupied the middle hours of the day. In the early years of the camp, prisoners were employed primarily in camp maintenance, construction, and basic agricultural and drainage work in the surrounding marshlands. Prisoners built roads. They drained swamps. They worked in gravel pits. The work was physically demanding and designed to be, not as industrial labor aimed at productive output, but as a mechanism of exhaustion and control. As the 1930s progressed, and as the camp's organizational integration with the broader German economy deepened, the nature of forced labor began to shift towards something with greater economic purpose. During the war years, this shift would become fundamental. But in the early period, the primary function of the work was, in the plainest terms, the breaking of the prisoner. Food, or more precisely, the insufficiency of food, was a constant feature of Dachau's prisoner experience. Rations were calculated at a level that sustained life in a minimal, often precarious sense. But they were not designed for the caloric demands of men performing hard physical labor in a cold climate. The daily food allocation typically consisted of some form of bread, a thin soup or gruel at midday, and minimal supplementation. Over weeks and months, this nutritional deficit compounded. Men who entered the camp in reasonable health found themselves progressively weakened. The body's reserves erode. Concentration, memory, emotional regulation, all of these capacities decline under sustained malnutrition. The prisoner's ability to think clearly, to plan, to organize any form of collective response was, among other things, physically undermined by the deliberate management of his hunger. Illness followed closely behind malnutrition. The barracks, particularly as the prisoner population grew, became environments in which disease spread with grim efficiency. Tuberculosis was a persistent presence throughout the camp's history. Malaria was, strangely, a particular problem in the early years, given the adjacent marshlands that the prisoners themselves were frequently assigned to drain. The medical infrastructure available to ordinary prisoners, as distinct from the medical facility used for non-consensual experiments, which I will address separately, was minimal and deliberately inadequate. Sick prisoners who could no longer work were not treated with the goal of recovery. They were managed. The distinction between those two things is not semantic. Evening roll call, like the morning roll call, could stretch from its scheduled duration into something much longer if the SS guards chose to extend it. or if the count did not immediately reconcile. The psychological weight of standing in cold open air, in thin clothing, after a day of exhausting labor, while guards work through a count that might be deliberately prolonged, is documented consistently across survivor accounts. It was a daily recurrence, not a single dramatic event, but a grinding, repeated assertion of total control. This is one of those aspects of the camp's functioning that I think is sometimes underemphasized in the historical literature, which tends understandably to focus on the most acute episodes, the chronic daily dimensions of the prisoner's experience, the accumulated weight of 1,000 roll calls, 1,000 insufficient meals, 1,000 mornings rising before light, is its own form of historical record. There were, within this system, spaces that prisoners carved out for themselves. Moments of human connection, of cultural resistance, of sustained internal life, that the camp's administrators could regulate but never fully eliminate. Prisoner clergy held prayers quietly in their barracks. Men who had been teachers or musicians before their arrest found ways to share knowledge or music in the brief periods between official activities. Correspondence with families, regulated, censored, but permitted in some periods, was a lifeline of extraordinary psychological importance. These moments do not redeem the system in any way. They simply document the tenacity of human presence within conditions designed to diminish it. One of the more overlooked aspects of the early Dachau prisoner population is the political sophistication of many of its inmates. The first prisoners, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, were, many of them, experienced political organizers. They had spent years building organizations, maintaining networks, working within hierarchical structures. When they arrived at Dachau, these skills did not evaporate. They were channeled, quietly, and of necessity covertly, into the maintenance of prisoner solidarity networks, the informal distribution of information within the compound, the quiet preservation of morale through collective identification. The SS was aware of this, which is one reason why Acre's regulations paid such specific attention to the crime of political agitation within the camp, punishable by death. The regime understood exactly who it had imprisoned and was not naive about their capabilities. By the mid-1930s, Dachau had settled into its operational rhythms. The initial improvisations had given way to routines. The staff had internalized the institutional culture. The prisoners had developed their own internal social structures and survival strategies. The camp was, in the bureaucratic language of the SS, functioning, and in the towns and villages of southern Bavaria, in the offices of Munich, on the trains that passed within sight of the camp's perimeter, life went on. People knew, in the general sense, that the camp was there. The nature of what occurred within it was not a secret that was perfectly kept. It was a reality that was by degrees normalized. That normalization is, in the long view of this history, one of the most sobering things to contemplate. Chapter 5, Kristallnacht, and the transformation of Dachau. There is a specific night in the history of this camp that marks a before and after, not in the camp's physical structure, not in its administrative regulations, but in the scale and category of who was imprisoned within it. That night was the 9th and 10th of November, 1938. It is remembered in history as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, though that name, with its almost aesthetic quality, has been criticized by historians as an inadequate descriptor for what was, in plain terms, a coordinated nationwide pogrom. I will use the name because it is the most widely recognized, while noting that the scholarly literature now frequently prefers the term November pogrom. Both names point at the same events. In the immediate aftermath of the pogrom, in the days of the 10th and 11th of November 1938, the Nazi regime moved to arrest Jewish men across Germany on a massive scale. The arrests were not about legal infractions. They were a statement, a physical, embodied demonstration of power and vulnerability. Almost 11,000 Jewish men were transported to Dachau in this period. This figure is worth holding for a moment against the camp's established capacity. A camp designed and rebuilt for roughly 6,000 men suddenly received nearly double that number in a matter of days. The barracks, already not comfortable, became acutely overcrowded, the administrative system strained. The experience of these Jewish men who arrived at Dachau in November 1938 was, by nearly all survivor accounts, deliberately and specifically brutal. They had not been prisoners before. They were businessmen, professionals, craftsmen, fathers, grandfathers. Some of them were veterans of the First World War who had served Germany in uniform and retained, even at this late stage, some belief that their service would constitute a form of protection or recognition. It did not. The ideological categories of the Nazi system had no room for the distinction between a German Jew who had fought in the Somme and a foreign Jew who had not. Within the camp, all of them were processed identically, subjected to the same registration, the same shaving, the same uniform, the same systematic humiliation. Most of these men, the majority of those who arrived in November 1938, did not remain at Dachau for long periods. This is historically significant and requires careful framing. The regime's intention in this phase was not permanent incarceration, but leverage. Jewish men were being released from Dachau from weeks to months after their arrival, with a condition that they demonstrate documented arrangements to emigrate from Germany. The camp was being used, in this period, as a mechanism of coercive emigration. Men emerged from Dachau, broken in ways that went beyond physical injury, and they left Germany as the regime intended, with their property confiscated, their businesses destroyed, and their communities shattered. The November 1938 influx marked a significant shift in who Dachau imprisoned, but it also clarified something about the trajectory of the regime's intentions. The early years of the camp, 1933 to perhaps 1937, had been primarily about political opponents, the left-wing parties, the trade unions, the organized resistance to National Socialism. The expansion to include Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, gay men, and asocials had broadened the category of prisoner without fundamentally changing the political logic. But the November 1938 arrests of Jewish men on purely racial grounds, men who had committed no act, joined no organization, written no pamphlet that could even be framed as opposition, represented something qualitatively different. It was persecution organized entirely around identity. Historiographical note: scholars have debated at considerable length the question of when exactly the Nazi regime's policy toward Jews shifted from persecution and coerced emigration to systematic extermination. The 1C Conference of January 1942 is often cited as a key administrative moment, though historians, including Christopher Browning and Raoul Hilberg, have documented the decision-making process as more gradual and distributed across multiple levels of the Nazi bureaucracy, rather than originating from a single meeting or document. Dachau's history illustrates this gradual nature well. The camp in 1938 was not yet a killing facility in the way that Auschwitz-Birkenau would later be. But the scale and logic of the November arrests pointed clearly in a direction that was becoming increasingly difficult to mistake. The winter of 1938 to 1939 at Dachau was, by any measure of the available documentation, one of the most difficult periods in the camp's early history. The overcrowding generated by the November influx, combined with the Bavarian winter and the chronic insufficiency of the camp's food and sanitary infrastructure, produced conditions in which disease and suffering were severe. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis moved through the overcrowded barracks. The death rate during this period rose sharply relative to the earlier years of the camp's operation. The administrative records from this period, where they survive, document these deaths with the same clerical precision as all others. Name, number, date, stated cause. By the spring of 1939, as the majority of the November prisoners had either been released or transferred, and as Germany moved steadily toward the war that Hitler had been preparing for, and that would begin with the invasion of Poland in September, the composition and character of Dachau's prisoner population stood at an inflection point. The camp had been, through most of the 30s, primarily a German institution holding German prisoners. The coming war would transform it into something continental in its reach. A camp that would hold men and women from dozens of nations, speaking dozens of languages, arrested under dozens of different rationales, that all ultimately served the same function. The elimination of every category of person the Nazi regime identified as incompatible with its vision of a remade Europe. It is worth noting, at this point in the documentary, that the German public's awareness of Dachau's existence was not, in this period, a hidden or protected state secret in the way that the later extermination camps in the East would be. Dachau was, in the early years of the regime, written about in newspapers. The Nazi government openly described it as a facility for the protective custody of enemies of the state. Members of the public took organized tours of the camp in its early years. Teachers, functionaries, Hitler youth leaders, as demonstrations of the regime's effectiveness at securing itself against internal threat. The camp was in this sense a propaganda tool as much as a detention facility. Its openness was itself a statement. We are doing this, and we are not afraid to say so. The transformation brought about by Kristallnacht and its immediate aftermath thus represents a crucial moment in Dachau's history, not merely because of its scale, nearly 11,000 men in days, but because of what it revealed about the camp's function within the broader system. It was not simply a place where opponents were held. It was a tool, deployable against any group the regime chose to designate. It could be pointed at political enemies, at religious nonconformists, at racial targets, at people whose only offense was existing within a category the regime found intolerable. This flexibility, the administrative capacity to receive and process any designated category of prisoner, was one of Dachau's most consequential features, and one that the next 6 years would demonstrate with terrible thoroughness. Chapter 6, The War Arrives, Dachau, after September 1939. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within weeks, the Second World War had been formally declared by Britain and France. Within months, the nature of existence in occupied Europe had begun its catastrophic transformation, and the camps that had been built within Germany's borders were about to receive what the war produced. Prisoners from occupied territories, from military conquests, from the expanding logic of a regime now operating on a continental scale. Dachau did not change its physical layout. It did not rebuild its barracks or redraw its perimeter. But the world that fed prisoners into those barracks changed utterly. In the period immediately following the outbreak of war, one of the most significant early changes to Dachau's prisoner population came from the German clergy and political prisoners who remained in the camp, as well as the first significant arrivals from occupied Poland. Polish political and intellectual elites, professors, priests, officers, professionals, were among the primary targets of the Nazi administration's effort to decapitate Polish civil society. Many of them arrived at Dachau in the first months and years of the war. The camp that had been, through most of the 1930s, a German domestic institution processing German prisoners, now received men who spoke a different language, came from a different culture, and had been arrested under the specific logic of colonial subjugation. The elimination of a people's capacity for organized self-governance, the treatment of Polish prisoners at Dachau, and the treatment of prisoners from other occupied nations as the war expanded followed patterns that built upon Dachau's existing procedures, but added layers of additional brutality specific to the racial and ideological categories the Nazi regime applied to different national groups. Poles, in the regime's racial hierarchy, occupied a category that consigned them to a level of treatment several degrees harsher than what German political prisoners had typically experienced in the camp's early years. Soviet prisoners of war, who began arriving after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, were treated with a harshness that reflected the regime's explicit policy of extermination toward captured Soviet soldiers, who were not protected under the Geneva Convention as far as the Nazi state was concerned. The single most numerically significant act of organized mass killing at Dachau during the war years was the murder of Soviet prisoners of war. At least 4,000 Soviet POWs were shot at Dachau following the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, executed in the camp's courtyard and later at a specially constructed shooting range on the SS training grounds adjacent to the camp. These men had survived combat only to be transported west into Bavaria and killed by administrative order in a facility that had been built years earlier for the protective custody of German political opponents. The scale and logic of these executions reflect the degree to which the category of prisoner at Dachau had expanded beyond anything that would have been recognizable in the camp's first years. The war also accelerated the development of Dachau's forced labor function in ways that aligned the camp's operation with the industrial and armaments needs of the German war economy. Beginning in the summer and autumn of 1944, as German war production became increasingly desperate, and as the labor requirements of armaments factories in southern Germany grew beyond what the available civilian workforce could meet, Dachau developed an extensive system of satellite camps, subcamps positioned near industrial facilities throughout the region. Dachau would ultimately have approximately 140 subcamps, primarily in southern Bavaria. These facilities held prisoners who were transported daily or housed adjacent to the factories where they labored. The nature of forced labor in the wartime subcamps was different in character from the construction and agricultural work of the pre-war years. Prisoners now worked on military equipment, aircraft components, and other armaments production. The German industrial firms that used this labor were not SS operations. They were private companies, major names in German industrial history, operating within a system in which prisoner labor was a resource provided by the SS at a price. This economic integration between the concentration camp system and private German industry is one of the most thoroughly documented and most carefully studied aspects of the Nazi camp system's wartime operation. The scholarship on this subject, economists and historians have spent decades examining the records, makes clear that the boundaries between the Nazi state's coercive apparatus and the broader German economy were, during the war years, far more permeable than post-war German public memory initially acknowledged. Within the main camp at Dachau during the war years, the population grew steadily and then, toward the end of the war, dramatically. The camp had been built in its rebuilt 1938 form to house roughly 6,000 men in tolerable conditions. By the later war years, the population of the main camp alone often exceeded that figure by multiples that the barracks and sanitary facilities were structurally incapable of supporting. Disease became chronic rather than episodic. Typhus, which had been a recurring threat throughout the camp's history, became a persistent epidemic condition in the later war years, spreading through a population that was overcrowded, malnourished, and without adequate medical support. The medical experiments conducted at Dachau, which began formally in 1942, belong to a chapter in the camp's history that I will address in depth in a later section of this documentary. But their initiation is historically located within the wartime context in a way that matters for understanding them. The Luftwaffe's interest in high-altitude physiology, in hypothermia and its effects on the human body, in the possibility of making seawater potable. These were not abstract scientific curiosities. They were questions generated by the specific conditions of a war being fought in the air, over the North Sea and the North Atlantic, where German pilots downed in cold water needed the regime's scientists to find answers as quickly as possible. The use of prisoners as non-consensual research subjects was the regime's solution to the practical problem of getting those answers. As the war extended into 1943 and 1944, the administrative records of Dachau reflect an institution under the strain of contradictory demands. The camp was receiving more prisoners than its infrastructure could support. Its prisoner labor was needed for industrial production, but the prisoners were increasingly too sick or too weakened to perform at productive levels. The SS medical staff, such as they were, and I use the term deliberately advisedly in this context, were managing an epidemic situation within a facility that had been designed without any serious provision for large-scale medical care. The documents from this period show an administrative apparatus straining under conditions that it was, in part, responsible for creating. There is a moment, somewhere in the reading of this history, where the sheer accumulation of documented fact becomes almost impossible to hold as a coherent narrative. The numbers, more than 200,000 prisoners, approximately 41,000 documented deaths, 140 subcamps, 38 nations represented in the prisoner population by the end. These figures are real, and they are backed by archival evidence, and they demand to be stated. But they also have a way of abstracting what they describe. I try throughout this documentary to remember that every one of those numbers was a person who had a morning before they arrived here, who had a name their mother gave them, who had things they loved and feared and hoped for. The documentation allows us to know the system. What we have to do, as human beings engaging with this history, is insist on also knowing that the system was made of people. Chapter 7. The Priests of Dachau. Faith behind the wire. There is a paradox buried within the administrative records of Dachau that I have never seen adequately explained by those who focus exclusively on the camp's political and racial dimensions. Dachau was, by the latter half of its operational life, the largest single concentration of imprisoned Christian clergy in the history of the 20th century. More than 2,600 priests, pastors, and deacons passed through its gates, the overwhelming majority of them Catholic priests from occupied Poland, but also significant numbers of German clergy, French priests, Dutch ministers, and men of faith from nearly every corner of occupied Europe. They were housed together largely in barracks 26, 28, and 30, in a section of the camp set aside specifically for clergy. This was not done out of respect. It was done because the SS found it administratively convenient to manage them as a group. The German Catholic clergy imprisoned at Dachau had arrived through a variety of pathways, but the underlying logic was consistent. The Nazi regime regarded institutional religion, particularly Catholicism with its allegiance to a transnational authority in Rome, as a competing source of moral and social power. Priests who delivered sermons critical of regime policy, who refused to remove crucifixes from schoolrooms, who maintained Catholic youth organizations after they had been formally dissolved, who wrote pastoral letters that implicitly or explicitly challenged the state's authority. These men found themselves targeted under the broad umbrella of Schutzhaft, the same protective custody statute that had been used against political opponents from the very beginning. The theological content of their objection mattered less to the SS bureaucracy than the political fact of it. The Polish clergy represented something different and numerically far larger. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Catholic Church in Poland was understood by the Nazi occupiers not merely as a religious institution, but as a central pillar of Polish national identity. To dismantle Polish national identity, which was the explicit goal of the occupation administration, particularly in the territories annexed directly into the Reich, required the systematic targeting of Polish clergy. Priests were arrested across occupied Poland in numbers that are still, nearly a century later, difficult to fully absorb. Of the more than 2,600 clergy imprisoned at Dachau over the course of the camp's operation, the majority were Polish. The death rate among Polish priests at Dachau was substantially higher than among their German counterparts, reflecting the compounding effects of harsher treatment, worse labor assignments, and the general differential in how the SS treated prisoners according to their nationality. Within the clergy barracks, a community formed. This is documented in the post-war testimonies of surviving priests, with enough consistency to be taken as reliable historical record, even accounting for the distortions that trauma and time impose on memory. The men shared prayer. They maintained, as best they could within the constraints of a place, where unauthorized gatherings could bring punishment, some form of liturgical life. From 1940 onwards, the camp administration actually permitted, with characteristic Nazi bureaucratic cynicism, the celebration of Mass within the chapel installed in Barracks 26, but only by German priests, and only under SS supervision. Polish priests were specifically excluded from this permission. The distinction was not theological, it was racial and national. The German clergy were being managed as a category to be handled. The Polish clergy were being managed as a category to be broken. Father John Bernard, a Luxembourg priest, who was imprisoned at Dachau from 1941 onwards, and who survived to write a detailed account of his experience, published after the war under the title Pfarrer Block 25487, referring to his prisoner number, provides some of the most granular available documentation of life in the clergy barracks. His account describes the daily routines, the social hierarchies that formed within the prisoner community, the relationship between different national groups of clergy, and the psychological strategies that men use to maintain coherence under conditions designed to eliminate it. Bernard's testimony is one of several first-hand clergy accounts that historians have drawn upon extensively. His prisoner number is known, his survival documented, and his account cross-referenced against SS administrative records, where those records survived. The labor assessments given to clergy were, in the general pattern, deliberately degrading. Men who had spent their lives in intellectual and pastoral work were assigned to the most physically demanding details available. The plantation work on the camp's agricultural operation, the drainage and construction details, the gravel pits, the plantation, a large agricultural and horticultural facility adjacent to the main camp, was one of the most feared work assignments in the entire camp, not because of any single dramatic feature, but because of the cumulative physical toll of outdoor labor under constant SS supervision, with inadequate food and clothing, in the demanding Bavarian climate. Older priests, and those who had arrived already weakened, were particularly vulnerable to the toll this work took. The question of how many clergy died at Dachau does not have a single clean answer, and I want to be honest about this historiographical difficulty rather than paper over it with a round number. The Dachau Memorial Site's research, drawing on surviving SS records and post-war testimony, has established documented deaths among the clergy prisoner population running into the hundreds. The uncertainty arises from the gaps in the administrative record, from deaths that occurred in the subcamps, where record-keeping was less thorough, and from the final chaotic months of the camp's operation in 1945, when systematic record-keeping had largely broken down. What is documentable is that a significant number of the men who entered the clergy barracks at Dachau did not leave them alive. One of the most compelling aspects of the clergy prisoner community, and one that I think deserves more attention than it typically receives in the general historical literature on Dachau, is the evidence of solidarity that extended across national boundaries. German priests sharing bread with Polish priests, French clergy translating SS announcements for men who did not speak German, the human instinct for community and mutual support operating against a system specifically designed to prevent both. These moments do not constitute resistance in the organized military sense. They are something quieter than that, the maintenance of basic human decencies under sustained institutional pressure to abandon it. In the context of a place like Dachau, quietness of that kind was its own form of defiance. After the war, surviving clergy from Dachau became important witnesses. Several of them participated in the Dachau trials conducted by the American military administration in 1945 and 1946. Their testimony contributed to the documentary record that established the legal basis for prosecuting camp administrators and guards. Father Bernard's published account, along with the testimonies of other surviving priests, entered the historical literature in the late 1940s and early 50s, and constitutes one of the earliest bodies of first-person documentation of life inside the camp. The clergy prisoners were, in this sense, among the first witnesses to make the interior experience of Dachau available to public understanding. There is a postscript to the history of the clergy at Dachau that belongs in this chapter rather than later. The chapel built on the memorial site in the decades after the war, which stands today as a functioning place of worship within the grounds of the former camp. Its existence is not uncontested. The question of what kinds of commemoration and religious presence are appropriate on the sites of Nazi atrocities has been a genuine subject of debate among historians, survivors' organizations, and religious communities for decades. That debate, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, is itself part of Dachau's long afterlife. The camp did not end its engagement with questions of faith and institutional religion when it was liberated in April 1945. Those questions followed it into the post-war decades and remain alive today. Chapter 8. The Medical Experiments. Science Without Conscience. I want to approach this chapter carefully because the subject it covers, the non-consensual medical experiments conducted on Dachau prisoners by SS doctors and researchers with affiliations to the German military and civilian scientific establishment, is one that has generated a specific kind of historiographical and ethical complexity that runs well beyond the straightforward documentation of what occurred. I will describe what happened as precisely as the documented record permits. I will not sensationalize, and I will try, as I have throughout this documentary, to frame these events within the institutional and political structures that enabled them, because understanding how this was possible matters as much as knowing what was done. The experiments at Dachau began formally in 1942, though preliminary discussions and planning had been underway before that. They were not the product of a single deranged individual operating outside institutional sanction. This is a point that the post-war trial records, specifically the doctor's trial conducted at Nuremberg, which began in December of 1946 and concluded in August of 1947, established with considerable clarity. The experiments at Dachau were requested, funded, and overseen by official bodies: the German Air Force, the German Navy, the Reich Research Council, and the SS itself. They were carried out by men who held academic credentials and SS rank simultaneously, who published results in scientific journals, who presented findings at conferences. The institutional apparatus surrounding the experiments was, in external form, entirely normal science. What it was doing was not. The first major series of experiments at Dachau involved high-altitude physiology. The German Luftwaffe needed to understand the effects of extreme altitude on the human body. Specifically, what happened to pilots who were forced to bail out at very high altitudes without supplemental oxygen, and what the limits of human survival were at pressure levels equivalent to altitudes of 15 kilometers or more. A low-pressure chamber was installed at Dachau. Prisoners were placed inside it. The pressure was reduced to simulate extreme altitudes. The effects on their bodies were observed and recorded. The research was conducted under the supervision of Dr. Sigmund Rascher, a German Air Force physician, who had secured Himmler's personal sponsorship for the program. Rascher's relationship with Himmler, cultivated through correspondence that began before the war, gave him access to Dachau and to the prisoner population as a research resource. His documentation of the experiment results survives and was introduced as evidence at Nuremberg. The second major series of experiments involved hypothermia, the effects of extreme cold on the human body. The military rationale was again drawn directly from combat conditions. German pilots and naval personnel who went into the cold waters of the North Sea and North Atlantic were dying of hypothermia at rates that the regime's military planners wanted to reduce. Prisoners at Dachau were immersed in tanks of ice water for extended periods. Temperature was measured. The process of dying from cold was documented with clinical precision. Survivors were then subjected to various proposed rewarming methods, including body heat from other human beings, hot water immersion, and exposure to sunlight. The results were recorded in reports that circulated through the Luftwaffe medical hierarchy and were discussed at a conference of military doctors held in October of 1942, at which Rascher presented his findings to an audience of medical professionals. More than 90 people attended that conference. None of them, in the moment, objected to the methodological basis of the research they were hearing presented. The third significant series of experiments at Dachau involved malaria. The camp's proximity to the Bavarian marshlands had made malaria a genuine problem in the early years of its operation, and the German military had an active interest in the development of treatments for a disease that was affecting troops in several theaters. Dr. Klaus Schilling, a tropical disease specialist who had spent decades studying malaria in legitimate scientific contexts before the war, was authorized to conduct malaria research at Dachau from 1942 onwards. Prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria parasites. Various drug treatments were then tested on them. More than 1,000 prisoners were used in Schilling's research. The death toll attributed to his experiments is documented in the post-war trial record, though the precise attribution of specific deaths to the experiments versus to the camp's general conditions of malnutrition and disease is, in some cases, a matter of historical debate. A fourth category of experiments, seawater potability research, was conducted in the summer of 1944. The German Air Force and Navy were both interested in whether seawater could be rendered safe to drink through chemical processing for the benefit of pilots and sailors stranded at sea. Prisoners at Dachau were divided into groups and subjected to different regimes. Some received only seawater treated by one proposed method. Some received seawater treated by another. Some received nothing. The experiment was conducted over several weeks. The physical deterioration of prisoners denied fresh water was acute and documented. That this research was conducted in 1944, when the war was clearly turning against Germany, when the Normandy landings had opened a western front, when the Red Army was advancing steadily from the east, is worth noting. The experiments continued even as the regime that authorized them was contracting toward its final collapse. The post-war legal reckoning for the Dachau medical experiments came through two primary channels. The doctor's trial, Nuremberg, formerly the medical case, United States versus Karl Brandt and others, prosecuted 23 defendants, including physicians and administrators involved in the concentration camp experiments. 7 were sentenced to death, 9 received prison sentences, and 7 were acquitted. Rascher himself did not stand trial. He had been arrested by the SS in 1944 on charges unrelated to the experiments, fraud and the false presentation of an adopted child as his own biological son, and was executed, apparently on Himmler's personal order, in the final days of the war. The specific circumstances of his death, in April 1945, in the chaos of the camp's final weeks, are not fully documented. Schilling, who had continued his research until liberation, was tried by an American military tribunal at Dachau and executed in May of 1946. The legacy of the Dachau medical experiments extends beyond the specific deaths of the prisoners who were subjected to them. The experiments were a direct catalyst for the development of the Nuremberg Code, the 10-point statement of research ethics adopted in August of 1947 as part of the judgment in the doctor's trial. The code's central principles: voluntary consent, the right of subjects to withdraw, the requirement that experiments be grounded in prior animal research, the prohibition of experiments expected to cause death or disabling injury, were written, in essence, as a direct response to what the evidence at Nuremberg had documented happening at Dachau and at other camps. The code became the foundation of modern research ethics. Its origin in the most extreme documented violation of those ethics is a historical irony that the field of bioethics has been engaging with for the better part of 8 decades. One historiographical issue that I want to raise here, because it genuinely complicates the history and because honest engagement with complexity is what this documentary exists to provide. The question of whether any of the data produced by the Dachau hypothermia experiments has legitimate scientific value, and whether that data should or should not be used in subsequent research on human thermoregulation, has been a genuine subject of debate within the medical and bioethics communities for decades. Scholars including Robert Pozos and Arnold Relman engaged this question in published exchanges in the 1980s and 90s. I am not going to resolve that debate here. I will simply say that the fact that the question is debated at all, that the experiments produced data precise enough to be considered scientifically relevant by some researchers decades later, adds a layer of disturbing moral complexity to the history that the straightforward language of condemnation, however deserved, does not fully capture. What I return to after the documentation and the legal records and the bioethics debates is the prisoners, the men who were put into the low-pressure chamber, the men who were immersed in ice water and whose temperatures were recorded at intervals by researchers with clipboards, the men who were deliberately infected with malaria. They did not consent. They had no meaningful capacity to refuse. They were prisoners in a concentration camp, and their bodies were made available to researchers by the administrative authority of the SS, with the institutional backing of the German Air Force and the Reich Research Council. Whatever the scientific outputs of those experiments may or may not be worth, the human beings who generated them through their suffering, and in many cases, their deaths, deserve to be remembered not as data points, but as the people they were before they arrived at the gate, with the lie written in iron above it. Chapter 9, The Subcamps. Dachau's long shadow across Bavaria. The main camp at Dachau, the walled and guarded central facility, northwest of Munich, with its grid of barracks and its electrified perimeter. This is what most people think of when they hear the name. But Dachau was not one place. By the final year of the war, it was 140 places. It was a constellation of satellite facilities scattered across southern Bavaria, into Austria, and into other parts of the German south, each one tethered to the administrative and SS structure of the main camp, each one drawing prisoner labor from Dachau's central population and routing that labor into the German war economy. The subcamp system is the dimension of Dachau's history that most complicates any attempt to understand the camp as a single, bounded location. It was, by the end, a regional institution on a scale that touched the lives of communities across a wide geography. The development of the subcamp network was not planned from the beginning. It grew organically, which is to say, bureaucratically and economically, in response to the wartime demand for labor. The process typically began with a request from a German industrial firm, a municipal authority, a construction company, or an armaments manufacturer, directed to the SS and specifically to the SS Economics and Administrative Main Office, known by its German abbreviation WH2, which managed the economic dimensions of the camp system. The WW would assess the request, negotiate a per-prisoner daily rate, the fee paid to the SS for providing prisoner labor, and arrange the transfer of prisoners from the main camp to the subcamp location. The administrative and financial records of this process survived the war in sufficient quantity to allow historians to reconstruct it with considerable detail. The subcamps varied enormously in their physical character, their size, their SS staffing, and the conditions they imposed on prisoners. Some were relatively small facilities holding a few hundred men adjacent to a single factory. Others were larger, more complex installations housing several thousand prisoners. The working conditions within them were similarly variable, not in the sense that any of them were humane, but in the specific texture of what inhumane meant in each location. Prisoners in aircraft manufacturing facilities worked in enclosed spaces, performing precision assembly tasks. Prisoners in quarries worked outdoors in all weathers, performing physically devastating extraction work. Prisoners in underground armaments facilities, built during the final years of the war, when Allied bombing had made above-ground production increasingly dangerous. Worked in conditions of confinement, inadequate ventilation, and extreme physical demand that produced death rates among the highest in the entire Dachau system. The economic integration of the subcamp prisoner labor force with private German industry is a subject that German historical scholarships spent several decades after the war reluctant to engage with directly. The post-war narrative in West Germany, for complex political and social reasons, tended to draw a sharp line between the SS, which was categorized as a criminal organization by the Nuremberg Tribunal, and German industrial and civilian society, which was treated as having been largely coerced or uninformed. The historical scholarship that emerged from the 1980s onward, particularly the work of scholars examining the records of individual German companies and their use of concentration camp labor, has substantially complicated this picture. The records show that firms negotiated directly with the WRA, that managers at individual factory sites had daily contact with prisoner populations, and that the conditions under which prisoners worked were not hidden from the civilian employees who worked alongside or above them. One of the most significant subcamps in Dachau's network was the facility at Kaufering, actually a complex of 11 separate camps located in the area southwest of Augsburg. The Kaufering camps were established in the summer of 1944, specifically to provide labor for a massive underground construction project, the building of enormous aircraft manufacturing facilities, designed to be immune to Allied bombing. The project was codenamed Ringeltaube, Wood Pigeon, and was one of several ambitious underground industrial programs that the Nazi leadership authorized as German air superiority collapsed and Allied bombing of German cities and industrial sites intensified. The Kaufering prisoners, the majority of them Jewish men deported, primarily from Hungary following the mass deportations of the spring and summer of 1944, worked on these construction projects in conditions that produced one of the highest documented death rates of any facility within the Dachau subcamp network. The Hungarian Jewish deportees who arrived in the Kaufering camps in the summer of 1944 represent one of the most numerically significant and historically important groups in the entire story of Dachau's wartime operation. Hungary's Jewish population, several 100,000 people, had survived relatively intact compared to the Jewish communities of Poland, the Soviet Union, and Western Europe, partly because Hungary, as an Axis partner rather than an occupied state, had retained some degree of internal administrative autonomy. When that autonomy ended in March of 1944 with a German military occupation, the deportations of Hungary's Jewish population proceeded with extraordinary speed under the supervision of Adolf Eichmann's office. Many of these deportees went directly to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Others were routed through the camp system to labor facilities, and a significant number arrived in the Kaufering complex and in other Dachau subcamps. Their arrival in this period, as the war was clearly approaching its final phase, meant that they had survived years of threat only to be subjected to forced labor under conditions that killed a devastating proportion of them in the final months before liberation. The SS staff at the subcamps presented a profile somewhat different from the longer-serving personnel at the main camp. Many were men who had not been part of the original Dachau Guard structure, drawn instead from a pool of SS personnel that included men deemed unfit for frontline duty, older men, and men with administrative backgrounds who found themselves in positions of authority over prisoner populations without the specific institutional socialization that EIC's original training programs had provided. This is not to say they were less brutal. The documentary record of individual subcamps includes documented atrocities committed by personnel at every level. But the subcamp system's reliance on a broader, less ideologically homogeneous staff contributed to the variation in conditions across the network. Some subcamps were administered with a level of casual brutality that even exceeded the main camp's codified punishments. Others were, by the grim relative standards of the system, marginally less severe. By the autumn of 1944, the Dachau subcamp network had become, in economic terms, the more significant dimension of the camp's operation. More prisoners were working in subcamps than in the main facility. More prisoner deaths were occurring in subcamps than in the main camp. The administrative center at Dachau continued to process new arrivals, maintain central records, and coordinate the flow of prisoners through the system. But the weight of the institution had shifted outward, distributed across a geography that made Dachau simultaneously one facility and a regional system. This distribution also created logistical problems as Allied forces advanced toward Germany in the final months of the war. Problems of what to do with the prisoners when the subcamps could no longer operate, which the SS would attempt to resolve through the death marches that I will address in the chapter that follows. The question of how much the civilian populations near subcamp facilities knew about what was occurring in them is, like the equivalent question about the main camp and the town of Dachau itself, one that the historical literature has engaged with at length and without reaching a single clean answer. What the records establish is that the subcamps were not, in most cases, hidden from civilian view. Factory workers saw prisoners. Train station employees watched prisoner transports arrive and depart. Local officials dealt with subcamp administrators on municipal matters. The physical conditions of prisoners, who were marched through town streets, to and from work sites, were visible. Knowledge, in the general sense of awareness of what was present, was widespread. Knowledge of the full system, its origins, its scale, and its ultimate intentions that existed in more variable gradations. What the scholarship resists, with considerable justification, is the use of this variability as a blanket exculpation for the communities that surrounded the camps. The subcamp network of Dachau is also, I should note, one of the dimensions of the camp's history that is still subject to active archival research. The work of identifying individual subcamps, establishing their locations with precision, documenting their prisoner populations, and recovering the histories of the people who lived and died in them is ongoing. The Dachau Memorial Site, working in collaboration with regional archives in Bavaria and with international research institutions, continues to add to the documented record. This is not a closed history. There are men and women whose experience of Dachau occurred not in the main camp, but in a factory outside Augsburg, or a quarry near Kaufering, or a construction site in the Austrian Alps, and whose specific stories are only now being recovered from the archival record. That ongoing recovery is one of the important things that historical institutions exist to perform, and it is worth supporting. Chapter 10, The Final Year, Collapse, Death Marches, and the Edge of Liberation. By the opening of 1945, Germany was losing the war in every measurable dimension. The Red Army had crossed into German territory from the east. American and British forces had entered Germany from the west. Following the crossing of the Rhine in March, the bomber offensive had reduced significant portions of German industrial capacity and urban infrastructure to rubble. The Nazi regime was contracting, month by month, toward a shrinking territory that it defended with a combination of increasingly young and old soldiers, ideological rigidity in the face of military reality, and a bureaucratic inertia that continued to process prisoners, to administer camps, and to send transports across a collapsing rail network, even as the ends of those rail lines grew nearer to the Reich's borders. For the prisoners of Dachau and its subcamp network, this moment of German collapse was one of the most dangerous periods of their imprisonment. Retreat for the SS did not mean release. The death marches, the forced movements of concentration camp prisoner populations ahead of Allied advances, are one of the most numerically significant and historically important dimensions of the Nazi camp system's final phase. And they are also one of the most difficult to document with precision, because they occurred in the chaos of a collapsing military situation, often without systematic record keeping, in locations scattered across hundreds of kilometers of disintegrating German-controlled territory. For Dachau, the marches began in earnest in the spring of 1945 as the Kaufering subcamps, along with other facilities in the broader network, came under threat from the advancing American forces. Prisoners who could walk were assembled and marched eastward and northward, away from the Allied advance, toward the main camp, or toward other destinations that were not always clearly defined, even by the SS personnel supervising the movement. The conditions on the marches were, by the documented record, catastrophic for the prisoners. They were people who had been subjected to months or years of forced labor, malnutrition, and disease. Many were already barely capable of sustained physical exertion. They were now being marched for days, sometimes weeks, with minimal food and water, in the early spring cold of Bavaria and Austria. Those who fell behind were, in documented instances, killed by their guards. Those who collapsed and could not continue were similarly killed, or left to die where they fell. The roads and forest tracks along which the marches moved were subsequently found by Allied troops and by local populations to contain the bodies of prisoners who had not survived. This evidence, the bodies on the roads, the pits along the march routes, was among the first physical proof that many American soldiers encountered of the camp system's final functioning, before they had even reached the main camp itself. The main camp at Dachau, in the final months, received the accumulated human residue of the collapsing subcamp network. Prisoners from Auschwitz-Birkenau and other eastern camps, evacuated as the Red Army advanced, arrived at Dachau in the winter of 1944 to 1945, in transports that were themselves horrific, crowded rail cars in which many prisoners died during journeys that had taken days or weeks. The main camp, already overcrowded beyond anything its infrastructure could support, absorbed these arrivals into conditions that were, by the spring of 1945, among the worst in its 12-year history. Typhus had become epidemic. The food supply had broken down, partly due to Allied bombing of German transport infrastructure, partly due to the general collapse of the administrative systems that had sustained the camp's supply chain. People were dying in very large numbers, at a rate the documentary record from this period cannot capture with complete precision, because the systematic record-keeping had itself largely ceased. The SS administration of the camp in these final months was operating under conflicting orders and conflicting pressures. Himmler, in the final period, was engaged in various back-channel negotiations with representatives of neutral countries and allied organizations, including the International Red Cross, whose representatives had been attempting for years to gain access to Dachau and had been largely denied. There were SS administrators within the camp system who, as the war's outcome became undeniable, were beginning to think about their own post-war futures and what cooperation or restraint in the final period might mean for their personal survival. There were others who remained committed to the regime's directives until the last possible moment. The interaction of these competing personal calculations within a disintegrating institutional structure produced the confused and often contradictory picture of the camp's final weeks. There is documented evidence, recovered from post-war investigations, that orders were at some point issued for the destruction of Dachau's prisoner population before Allied forces could reach the camp. The precise nature and source of these orders, and the degree to which they were actually acted upon, is a matter on which the historical record is not entirely clear. What is established is that the full destruction of the prisoner population did not occur, that when American forces arrived on the 29th of April, 1945, they found tens of thousands of prisoners alive, though many of them in states of profound physical deterioration. Whether this was due to the orders being countermanded, to the speed of the Allied advance, to individual SS decisions to disregard or delay, or to some combination of these factors is not established with certainty in the surviving documentation. The final weeks also saw the SS move prisoners on an extraordinary forced march northward from Dachau toward the Austrian Alps, the so-called Alpine Redoubt, that Hitler and certain senior Nazi figures believed or professed to believe could serve as a final defensive position for the regime. A column of several thousand prisoners departed Dachau on the 26th of April, 1945, moving southward through the Bavarian countryside. The conditions on this march, which lasted several days, were as severe as those on the earlier Kaufring marches. The column was overtaken by American forces on the 1st of May, 1945, after Germany's surrender had effectively become certain. The liberation of this column on the road, rather than at the camp, is one of the less documented, but historically significant dimensions of Dachau's final days. The International Committee of the Red Cross made its first permitted visit to the main camp at Dachau on the 26th of April, 1945, 3 days before the American liberation. The ICEL representative, Victor Maurer, negotiated with Camp Commandant Martin Weiss for the transfer of responsibility and attempted to arrange for the protection of the prisoner population in the interim before American forces arrived. Maurer remained at the camp during the liberation. His report, filed afterward with the ICL in Geneva, is one of several first-hand accounts from non-prisoner witnesses to the camp's condition in its final days. The report's clinical language, the language of an experienced humanitarian official filing an institutional document, cannot fully contain the weight of what it describes. By the last week of April 1945, the sounds of artillery were audible from within the camp. Prisoners who had survived long enough to reach this moment knew, with the particular knowledge of people who have been watching the world beyond their fence for signs of change, that something was happening. The German civilian and SS world outside the wire was visibly in motion. Roads carrying military vehicles going in multiple directions, authority structures that had seemed permanent for years, dissolving in front of observable evidence. Inside the camp, in the final days, the relationship between the remaining SS guards and the prisoner population entered a phase of extraordinary tension. With guards uncertain of what to do, prisoners uncertain of whether liberation or a final massacre was coming, and both groups aware that the outcome of the next few days would determine which of those possibilities materialized. It was, by the accounts of those who survived it, one of the most psychologically extreme periods of an already extreme existence. The historical weight of the Death March period, the documented killing of prisoners on the roads, the bodies found along the march routes, the catastrophic mortality in the final overcrowded months at the main camp, is part of what the post-war trials at Dachau were organized to address. American military authorities moved quickly after liberation to document what they found. They photographed, catalogued, and interviewed. They preserved evidence. The speed and thoroughness with which this documentation was undertaken reflected both the scale of what had been found and the determination to ensure that the record could not later be denied. That determination was, as subsequent decades would demonstrate, only partly successful in preventing denial. But the documentary record created in the weeks following liberation remains one of the most important evidentiary foundations for everything that has been established about Dachau since. Chapter 11, the 29th of April, Liberation and its aftermath 900 hours, or somewhere near 9 o'clock in the morning, on the 29th of April, 1945. Elements of the 45th Infantry Division of the United States Army. The Thunderbirds, a National Guard division that had fought its way from North Africa through Sicily, through southern Italy, through the liberation of France, through the Rhineland, and into the Bavarian heartland, arrived at the perimeter of the Dachau concentration camp. They had been pushing through the area for days. They knew, from intelligence reports and from the evidence they had been encountering on the roads, that something significant was nearby. They did not know, in the specific sense of first-hand experience, exactly what they were about to find. What they found in the rail yard adjacent to the camp was a train of nearly 40 cars that had arrived at Dachau, carrying prisoners evacuated from the Buchenwald concentration camp in the east. Prisoners who had been loaded into the cars days or weeks earlier and transported westward as Allied forces closed in on their original location. A significant number of the people in those cars had not survived the journey. American soldiers who encountered this train, whose accounts are documented in unit reports, personal letters, and post-war testimonies, described an experience that permanently altered their understanding of what the war in Europe had been about. The evidence of what the SS had been doing was not abstract, was not a briefing document or a report from higher command. It was present, physical, and undeniable. Inside the camp itself, American soldiers encountered approximately 32,000 surviving prisoners. The word surviving requires some qualification in this context. Many of those 32,000 were alive in the narrow, technical sense. Their hearts were still beating when the Americans arrived, but they were in states of extreme physical deterioration that medical personnel who arrived with and behind the combat troops were not entirely prepared for. Severe starvation, advanced tuberculosis, typhus, injuries from the final weeks of guard violence. The medical challenge that confronted American military physicians in the days and weeks following liberation was itself an extraordinary episode in the history of military medicine, requiring improvisation, rapid resource deployment, and the adjustment of standard medical protocols to address a patient population unlike anything that peacetime or conventional combat casualty care had produced. The reaction of the American soldiers to what they found at Dachau has been documented extensively in personal accounts, military records, and post-war oral history projects. The soldiers were overwhelmingly young men in their late teens and 20s who had spent years at war and who were not unfamiliar with death and its consequences. Many of them had fought through multiple campaigns. None of their previous experience had prepared them for what Dachau presented. The accounts describe a range of responses: shock, grief, rage, physical illness, a kind of silence that fell over men who ordinarily spoke freely. These emotional responses are historically important, not because they are surprising, but because they were so consistent across the documented testimony of soldiers from different backgrounds and different units. The question of what happened to SS guards in the immediate aftermath of liberation is one that American military historians and legal scholars have examined with some care. Because the events of the 29th of April 1945 at Dachau sit at a complicated intersection of war, law, and the limits of human endurance. A number of SS guards were killed by American soldiers in the hours following the camp's entry. The precise circumstances of these killings, the number of guards involved, and the degree to which they constituted summary execution, as opposed to deaths in the course of ongoing military engagement, are points to which the historical record contains some ambiguity, and on which the documentary evidence from the period presents versions that do not entirely reconcile with each other. The army conducted an investigation. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, ultimately declined to pursue courts-martial. The historical literature on this episode engages with the moral and legal complexity without, in most cases, reaching a single settled judgment. Among the liberated prisoners, the hours and days following the American arrival were emotionally extraordinary in ways that survivor testimony captures with consistent intensity. Men who had been imprisoned for years, some for the entire 12-year existence of the camp, encountered freedom in a form so sudden and so dissonant with their established reality that the psychological adjustment was not instantaneous. Some prisoners were physically too ill to respond visibly to what was happening around them. Others wept. Others sought out the guards who remained and confronted them. Others simply sat or stood in the April sunshine and were present to the fact of survival, which was itself a form of cognitive labor. After the sustained effort of enduring what they had endured, the American military administration moved quickly to establish a functioning provisional authority within the camp. Medical units were deployed. Food supplies, carefully managed, because the medical understanding of the period recognized that severely malnourished people could be harmed rather than helped by sudden access to unrestricted food, were organized and distributed. The typhus epidemic, which remained active in the liberated camp, was addressed through a combination of delousing, quarantine, and the medical treatment of infected prisoners. The former SS administrative buildings became American military offices. The transition from concentration camp to liberated facility was not instantaneous. It took weeks, and during those weeks, additional prisoners died from the conditions that liberation itself could not immediately reverse. American military photographers and journalists were among the first non-military personnel to enter the camp in the days following liberation. The images and reports they produced were among the most widely published documentation of the Nazi camp system to reach the American public during the war. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, ordered that as many American military personnel as could be spared from operational duties be brought to view the camps, Dachau among them, specifically because he anticipated that in the post-war years, people would deny that these places had existed and that what had occurred in them had occurred. His order was not about punishment or about public spectacle. It was about the creation of witnesses, the deliberate multiplication of human testimony, as a bulwark against the anticipated amnesia of history. German civilians from the town of Dachau and surrounding communities were, in this same period, organized by American military authority into work parties that were brought to the camp and required to assist in the burial of the dead. The moral logic of this requirement is documented in the orders and correspondence of American military commanders. That those who had lived adjacent to this institution, who had in various ways benefited from or been complicit in its existence, should not be permitted to maintain the fiction that it had been invisible to them, whether this requirement was legally justifiable, whether it was effectively executed, and what its impact on the German civilians involved actually was. These questions have been discussed in the post-war literature, with varying conclusions. What is not disputed is that it happened, and that it was part of the American military administration's deliberate strategy of confrontation with complicity. Liberation on the 29th of April, 1945, was not the end of Dachau's story in any simple sense. For the survivors, the physical liberation of the camp was the beginning of a long and uneven process of recovery. Physical, psychological, and in the most difficult cases, simply biological, as bodies attempted to restore themselves after years of systematic destruction. For the historical record, liberation was the moment at which the inside of Dachau became visible to the outside world in its full documented dimensions. For the town of Dachau, for Germany, and for the broader question of how human communities understand and account for what they have permitted or enabled, liberation was the opening of a reckoning that is, in some of its most important dimensions, still underway. Chapter 12, Judgment. The Dachau Trials and the Architecture of Accountability. In November of 1945, less than 7 months after American forces had liberated the camp, a United States military tribunal convened at Dachau. The building used for the trials was, with a historical irony that was not lost on the participants, a former SS administrative building within the camp complex itself. The trials that took place at Dachau between 1945 and 1948, distinct from but related to the more famous proceedings at Nuremberg, were the largest series of war crimes trials conducted by American military authority in the European theatre. Across multiple proceedings, they addressed the crimes committed at Dachau itself, at the Malmedy massacre, at the Mauthausen concentration camp, at the Flossenburg camp, and at other sites. The Dachau trial proceedings in total involved over 1,600 defendants and produced more than 250 death sentences. The first and most significant of the Dachau trials was the case against the main camp's personnel, known formally as United States versus Martin Gottfried Weiss and others, which began on the 15th of November, 1945. Weiss, the last commandant of the main Dachau camp, was among 40 defendants who were tried simultaneously in what was, for the time, a novel and legally contested approach to war crimes prosecution. The concept of common design, which held that individuals who participated in the operation of a concentration camp were individually responsible for the crimes of the institution, even if direct personal responsibility for a specific act of killing could not be established for each defendant. The legal theory was innovative, drawing on American military law, and it was challenged by defense counsel during the proceedings. The defense counsel at the Dachau trials were American military lawyers, officers assigned to represent the defendants as required by military legal procedure. Several of them took their duties seriously and mounted genuine legal defenses, arguing not that the defendants were innocent of the broad facts, but that the legal theories and procedures of the tribunal were inadequate or improper. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas T. Bates, among others, filed formal protests against aspects of the proceedings. This is a point that the historical literature on the Dachau trials takes seriously, because the criticism of trial procedure, that confessions were obtained improperly, that the rules of evidence were applied inconsistently, that the common design theory was legally untested, did not come exclusively from German sources seeking to discredit the outcomes, but also from American lawyers operating within the system. The historiographical debate about the procedural fairness of the Dachau trials is real and should not be dismissed, even as the fundamental factual record of what occurred at the camp remains clearly and overwhelmingly established. All 40 defendants in the main Dachau case were convicted. 36 were sentenced to death. 4 received life imprisonment. The death sentences were subject to review by American military authority, and a number of them were subsequently commuted in the years that followed, as the political context of the early Cold War created pressures that moderated the execution of war crimes judgments. This commutation process, the reduction of sentences, the early release of some convicted war criminals, the declining political will to pursue accountability as the Western powers and West Germany became Cold War partners, is one of the most controversial dimensions of post-war justice in Germany, and Dachau's legal aftermath sits squarely within that broader controversy. Men who had been condemned to death for what they did at Dachau were, in some cases, free within a decade of the verdict. Martin Weiss, the camp commandant, was executed by hanging at Landsberg prison on the 28th of May, 1946, along with 27 other convicted Dachau personnel. Landsberg was historically significant as the prison where Hitler had been incarcerated following the failed Munich Putsch of 1923, and where he had dictated Mein Kampf. The choice of this location for the execution of Nazi war criminals was not made without awareness of that history. The hangings at Landsberg continued across multiple subsequent proceedings, and the prison became, in the immediate post-war period, the primary site of American-administered war crimes executions in the European theatre. The doctor's trial at Nuremberg, which addressed the medical experiments conducted at Dachau and other camps, ran separately from the main Dachau proceedings and produced, as previously noted, the Nuremberg Code, but its relationship to the Dachau trial record is close. The medical evidence presented at Nuremberg drew heavily on documentation recovered from Dachau, on the testimony of survivors of the experiments, and on the medical records that the camp's own administrative apparatus had generated. Dr. Klaus Schilling, who had conducted the malaria experiments, was tried not at Nuremberg but at Dachau by the American Military Tribunal, and was executed at Landsberg on the 28th of May, 1946, on the same day as Weiss and the other main camp personnel. He was 74 years old at the time of his execution. The broader Nuremberg proceedings, the international military tribunal that tried the major war criminals, intersected with Dachau's history in multiple places. Documents recovered from Dachau were introduced as evidence. Witnesses who had been imprisoned there testified. The testimony of prisoners about conditions in the camp contributed to the evidentiary record used to establish the criminal character of the SS as an organization. Designation that had direct legal consequences for the Dachau trial proceedings and for subsequent prosecutions. The relationship between the various post-war trial proceedings was complex and cross-referential. with each drawing on evidence and legal developments from the others, in ways that the architects of international criminal law have studied extensively. West German courts took up the prosecution of former Dachau personnel in subsequent decades, with cases continuing into the 1970s and beyond as survivors and investigators continued to identify individuals who had served at the camp and who had not been prosecuted in the immediate post-war period. These later proceedings faced the familiar challenges of all delayed prosecutions. Witnesses who had died or whose memories had faded. Defendants who were elderly evidentiary records that had been lost or compromised in the intervening decades. The German legal system's engagement with Nazi crimes was, to say the least, uneven in the first post-war generation, complicated by the presence of former Nazi party members and functionaries within the judiciary itself, by public ambivalence about sustained prosecution, and by the political priorities of rebuilding a functioning state. The scholarly literature on this subject, including the foundational work of Robert Moeller and Norbert Frey on the politics of the Nazi past in West Germany, provides the framework for understanding why justice in these cases was so partial and so long delayed. The question of what accountability for Dachau ultimately looked like across the immediate post-war trials, the later German proceedings, and the broader legal and political responses of the decades that followed, is one that does not resolve into a satisfying conclusion. Some of the men who ran the camp, who designed its punishments, who conducted its experiments, or who guarded its perimeter and enforced its daily routines, faced legal consequences. Others did not. The men at the top of the SS administrative structure, who built the system that Dachau exemplified. Himmler killed himself with a concealed cyanide capsule on the 23rd of May, 1945, days after his capture by British forces. Ike himself, the man whose organizational genius had made the Dachau system exportable across the entire camp network, had been killed in combat in Russia in February of 1943, commanding an SS armored division on the Eastern Front, before any legal reckoning was possible. The gap between the scale of what was done and the scale of what was legally addressed is one of the permanent, irresolvable features of Dachau's legal aftermath, as it is of the broader reckoning with Nazi crimes. More than 200,000 people passed through this camp, more than 40,000 documented deaths, hundreds of thousands more in the satellite network. The legal proceedings, at their most comprehensive, prosecuted hundreds of individuals. The ratio of crime to consequence is one that the law, with its procedural requirements and its political contexts, was structurally incapable of correcting. This is not an argument for abandoning legal accountability. The trials mattered, the verdicts mattered, the Nuremberg Code mattered. It is simply an honest statement about the limits of law in the face of institutional crime on the scale that Dachau represents. What the trials accomplished, beyond individual verdicts and sentences, was the creation of a documentary record of extraordinary comprehensiveness and legal credibility. The evidence assembled for the Dachau trials, the Nuremberg proceedings, and the subsequent German prosecutions constitutes one of the most thoroughly documented bodies of evidence for any series of crimes in human history. This record has served as the primary evidentiary foundation for the historical scholarship on Dachau for 8 decades. It has provided the basis for refuting, with specific documented evidence, the denials and minimizations that have been attempted at various points in the post-war decades. Judgment, in the legal sense, was incomplete and imperfect, but the record that judgment produced is one of the things that makes honest engagement with this history possible. And that is not nothing. Chapter 13. The Memorial. Building memory on the ground of atrocity. There is a specific kind of silence that descends on people when they walk through the gate at Dachau today. Not the silence of emptiness, The site receives hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. But the silence of people who have arrived somewhere that demands a particular quality of attention. The memorial site that now occupies the ground of the former concentration camp is one of the oldest and most visited Holocaust memorial institutions in the world. Its history, however, did not begin on the 29th of April, 1945, with liberation. The transformation of this place from a site of atrocity into a site of memory was not immediate, not straightforward, and not without conflict. It took decades, and the story of how it happened is itself a chapter in the broader history of how Germany and Europe and the world has tried to reckon with what the Nazi period produced. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, the camp's physical infrastructure was not preserved as a historical site. It was used. American military forces occupied the camp complex and operated it initially as a detention facility for SS prisoners awaiting trial. In this first post-war period, the buildings that had been instruments of Nazi terror became, with a certain grim pragmatism, instruments of Allied military administration. The prisoner barracks, the administrative buildings, the SS's training grounds adjacent to the main camp, all of these were pressed into the service of the post-war occupation. The symbolic weight of using the camp buildings for these purposes was noticed and commented upon at the time. But the practical requirements of managing thousands of captured SS men and processing war crimes proceedings in the immediate aftermath of the war took precedence over considerations of historical preservation. After the American military's use of the facility diminished, the campgrounds were occupied by German refugees and displaced persons, specifically people expelled from the former German territories in the east, the Sudetenland and Silesia and other areas, who needed housing as post-war Germany attempted to absorb enormous numbers of people into a destroyed economy. A residential settlement grew up on the former campgrounds. Families lived in the converted barracks. Children played where the roll call square had been. The physical evidence of the camp's function, the barbed wire, some of the guard towers, the central administrative structures, was not removed, but it was surrounded and in some ways obscured by the mundane reality of post-war habitation. This coexistence of ordinary civilian life with the preserved remnants of atrocity was not unique to Dachau. It happened at other camp sites across Germany and occupied Europe. But at Dachau, it persisted for longer than might seem easily explicable from a contemporary perspective. The first serious organized efforts to create a permanent memorial at Dachau emerged in the 1950s, driven primarily by survivor organizations, groups of former prisoners who had returned, in many cases, to Germany, and who believed that the site needed to be marked, preserved, and made into a place of education and commemoration, rather than forgotten or absorbed into the landscape of post-war normality. The Comité International de Dachau, an organization of former prisoners from multiple nations, was central to this effort. Their advocacy faced considerable resistance, not simply from German authorities reluctant to maintain a visible reminder of the Nazi period, but from the communities adjacent to the site, from bureaucratic indifference, and from the broader West German political culture of the 1950s, which was engaged in the complex and not always honest work of rebuilding national identity in the shadow of what the Third Reich had done. The formal establishment of the Dachau concentration camp memorial site, the KZ Gedenkstätte Dachau, came in 1965, when the Bavarian state government and the Comité International de Dachau reached an agreement that enabled the creation of a permanent memorial and educational institution on the former campgrounds. The residential settlement was gradually cleared. The central structures of the prisoner compound, the Urhaus with its Arbeit macht frei gate, the maintenance building, the roll call square, were preserved. The outlines of the demolished prisoner barracks were marked in the ground, their foundations delineated, so that visitors could understand the physical scale of the compound. Two reconstructed barracks were built to allow visitors to understand the physical conditions of imprisonment. The transformation of the site into a functional memorial was, by the time it opened to the public, a product of more than 2 decades of advocacy and negotiation. The memorial's approach to documentation and education has evolved significantly over the decades since its 1965 opening, reflecting broader shifts in how historians, memorial institutions, and educational systems have understood their responsibilities in engaging with Holocaust history. The early memorial focused significantly on the political prisoner experience. The communists, social democrats, and other opponents, who had been Dachau's first population, reflecting the post-war political landscape in which survivor organizations were primarily organized around political identity. Over time, the memorial has expanded its scope to give fuller weight to the Jewish prisoner experience, to the clergy prisoners, to the Soviet POWs, to the victims of the medical experiments, and to the subcamp prisoner population. This expansion reflects decades of scholarly research and, in some cases, advocacy by specific survivor communities who felt their experience had been inadequately represented. The question of religious commemoration at the Dachau Memorial Site is one of the most historically layered dimensions of its post-war existence. Several religious memorial structures were built on the grounds in the years following the site's establishment. A Catholic chapel, a Protestant Church of Atonement, a Jewish memorial, and a Russian Orthodox chapel. The presence of these structures on the ground of a camp that had imprisoned and killed large numbers of clergy and Jewish prisoners has been understood in different ways by different communities. For some survivors and descendants, they represent appropriate acknowledgement of the spiritual dimensions of what occurred there and of the communities most affected. For others, the specifically Catholic structures carry the additional weight of the broader question of the institutional Catholic Church's relationship to the Nazi regime, a question that Dachau's history of imprisoned priests does not by itself answer cleanly. The Jorhaus Gate, with its Arbeit macht frei inscription, has a specific post-war history that deserves mention. The original gate was stolen, removed by thieves, in November of 2010. The theft, widely reported internationally, generated significant discussion about the vulnerability of memorial sites and about the specific motivations of people who seek to possess or destroy artifacts of this kind. The gate was recovered in Norway in 2011. Disassembled and hidden, it is now preserved within the memorial's documentation center. A replica stands in its original position. The episode, though it has a resolution of sorts, illustrated something about the ongoing vulnerability of physical memory, the degree to which the material artifacts of this history require active protection and cannot simply be left to persist on their own. The documentation center at the memorial site, which opened in its current, significantly expanded form in 2003, is the intellectual heart of the institution. It houses archival materials, survivor testimonies, photographic records, and the administrative documents that have survived from the camp's 12-year operational period. It provides educational programs for school groups. More than 100,000 students visit annually from Germany and from across Europe, and maintains active research partnerships with universities and historical institutions internationally. The Documentation Center's existence as a research institution, rather than simply a commemorative one, reflects the understanding that memory without documented evidence is vulnerable in ways that documented evidence, properly maintained and properly contextualized, is not. What the Dachau Memorial Site represents in the long view of the camp's history is an ongoing argument. An argument made in stone and preserved documents and educational programs, and the preserved outlines of demolished barracks, about whether memory of this kind can be sustained across generations that have no direct personal connection to the events being remembered. That argument is not won. Each generation that visits the memorial site makes its own encounter with the evidence. Each school group that walks through the Dachau is, in the most important sense, making a choice about whether to take seriously what the documentation describes. The memorial can provide the evidence. It cannot compel the response. That limitation, which is the limitation of all historical education, is also, in its way, the reason that places like Dachau's memorial site must continue to exist, must continue to be funded and maintained and staffed by people who understand what they're preserving and why. Chapter 14, Denial, Distortion, and the Battle for Historical Memory. Every documented atrocity in modern history has generated, in its aftermath, an organized effort to deny, minimize, or distort the record of what occurred. Dachau is no exception. The Holocaust denial movement, whose practitioners operate under various names and in various national contexts, but whose core claims are consistent across them, has included specific attacks on the historical record of Dachau as part of its broader effort to challenge the documented history of the Nazi camp system. Understanding these attacks and understanding why they fail against the evidentiary record is a necessary dimension of any serious engagement with Dachau's history. I want to approach this carefully because giving these arguments more space than they deserve is itself a form of distortion. But refusing to address them at all leaves the historical record undefended against claims that, in various cultural and political environments, continue to find audiences. The most persistent specific denial claim related to Dachau concerns the camp's gas chamber. The Dachau Memorial Site contains a gas chamber, a room fitted with the standard features of a Nazi gas chamber installation, including the overhead fixtures from which poison gas would be introduced. Denial literature has long claimed, with considerable insistence, that the gas chamber at Dachau was never actually used for killing, that it was built but not operated, and that its presence on the memorial site therefore represents either American wartime fabrication or post-war misrepresentation designed to create a more extreme impression of the camp's function. The historical record on this specific question is, in fact, genuinely complex, and being honest about that complexity is not the same as endorsing the denial argument. The scholarly consensus, as established through decades of archival research, survivor testimony review, and forensic investigation, is that the gas chamber at Dachau was constructed and equipped for use, but that there is insufficient direct documentary evidence to establish definitively the number of people killed in it at the main camp, as opposed to the documented use of gas chambers at other facilities within the broader camp system. The Dachau Memorial Site itself, in its official documentation, acknowledges this evidentiary complexity rather than asserting certainty where certainty is not established. This kind of honest engagement with genuine historiographical ambiguity is precisely what distinguishes serious scholarship from both denial and from uncritical assertion. The honest answer is, the chamber was built, it was equipped, its use at the main camp is attested to by some survivor testimony, and the documentary evidence for the precise scale of its use does not match the documentary evidence available for other aspects of the camp's operation. What denial arguments do, characteristically, is take genuine historiographical complexity of the kind just described and weaponize it, presenting uncertainty on a specific, narrow point as evidence of broader fabrication or invention. The logical gap between the precise use of one specific gas chamber at the main Dachau facility is incompletely documented, and therefore the broader record of atrocity at Dachau is unreliable, is not an argument. It is a rhetorical maneuver. The broader record, The 40,000 documented deaths, the medical experiments confirmed by the Nuremberg trial record, the forced labor documented in industrial company archives, the survivor testimonies cross-referenced against SS administrative records, does not rest on the resolution of the gas chamber question. It rests on an archival foundation of extraordinary depth and multiple source corroboration. The specific arguments made by Holocaust denial writers about Dachau have been examined and refuted in detail by historians including Robert Jan van Pelt, Deborah Lipstadt, and Richard Evans, whose expert witness testimony in the Irving versus Penguin books and Lipstadt libel trial in 2000 constitutes one of the most thoroughly documented public refutations of denial methodology ever produced. Evans's analysis of how denial writers select, distort, and misrepresent historical sources, approaching the evidence not as scholars asking what happened, but as advocates looking for evidence to support a predetermined conclusion, is methodologically important far beyond the specific Holocaust denial context. It is a demonstration in rigorous detail of what distinguishes honest historical inquiry from motivated misrepresentation. Beyond the organized denial movement, Dachau's historical memory has also been shaped by the more diffuse, and in some ways more socially significant phenomenon of normalization and forgetting. The gradual erosion of engaged historical memory, memory that occurs not through active denial, but through the simple passage of time, the dying of direct witnesses, and the tendency of subsequent generations to relate to historical atrocity as abstract event, rather than as the specific experience of specific human beings. This is a process that memorial institutions, educational systems, and historians work against constantly, with tools that are strong in some periods and weak in others. The Dachau Memorial's decision to expand its documentation center and its educational programs in the early 2000s reflected a specific awareness that the generation of direct survivors was passing, and that the strategies of memory appropriate to a period when survivors could testify in person were going to need to be supplemented by documentary and archival approaches that could carry the weight of testimony across generational boundaries. The specific history of how Dachau and Nazi crimes more broadly were remembered and taught in West Germany during the first post-war decades is a subject of considerable historical scholarship. The early Federal Republic was, as historians including Norbert Frey have documented in substantial detail, a state that contained a significant number of former Nazi Party members and functionaries within its civil service, judiciary, and professional establishment. The political logic of building a stable democratic West German state as a Cold War partner of the United States created pressures toward amnesty, toward the commutation of war crimes sentences, and toward a public culture that preferred to emphasize German victimhood, the bombing, the expulsions, the Eastern Front, over German perpetration. This is not a simple story of bad faith. Though bad faith played a role, it is also a story of the complex, sometimes painful, and ultimately necessary process by which a society that had participated in or acquiesced to atrocity attempts to reconstitute itself as something different. The generational shift in German public engagement with the Nazi past that occurred in the 1960s and the intensification of that shift in the 1970s and 80s, driven in part by the student movements of '68, in part by the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of the early 1960s, and in part by individual works of history and journalism and literature that refused the comfortable silences of the early Federal Republic, fundamentally changed the context in which the Dachau Memorial operated. The generation that had been children or young adults during the Nazi period, and whose parents had in many cases been participants or bystanders, began asking questions that the immediate post-war period had not pressed with sufficient force. The question of what their parents had known, what they had done, and what the relationship was between ordinary German society and the extraordinary criminality of the regime they had supported. This question became, over the course of the 70s and 80s, one of the defining cultural and political preoccupations of West German public life. The unification of Germany in 1990 introduced new complexities into the politics of Nazi memory, because East Germany had developed its own narrative of the Nazi period, one that framed the GDR as the legitimate heir of German anti-fascism and the Federal Republic as the state that had protected and rehabilitated the perpetrators. This narrative had its own distortions and its own political functions, but it also meant that the two German states, when they unified, brought with them different institutional memories of the Nazi period that needed to be integrated into a single national framework. The Dachau Memorial Site, as a Bavarian and therefore West German institution, had developed its approaches to education and commemoration within the West German cultural context. The integration of East German perspectives, East German survivor communities, and the specific history of how the Nazi camps had been memorialized in East Germany added further layers to an already complex institutional history. Where does Dachau's memory stand today, in the mid-2020s, as the last direct survivors reach extreme old age or have passed away entirely? It stands, I think, at a genuinely critical transition point, the moment when living memory gives way entirely to documented memory, when the human testimony of those who were present becomes definitively historical record rather than personal account. This transition has been anticipated and prepared for by the memorial institution, by historians, by filmmakers and educators. But no amount of preparation fully replaces the particular authority of a human being who says, "I was there, this is what I saw, this is what was done to me, and I am telling you so that you cannot later say you did not know." That authority is passing from the world. What remains is the archive, the memorial site, the documented record, and the choices of subsequent generations about whether to engage with it with the seriousness it requires. Chapter 15: Dachau's Long Shadow. What the first camp left behind 12 years. From the 22nd of March, 1933, to the 29th of April, 1945, Dachau operated without interruption. It predated the war by 6 years. It opened when the regime was new and tentative, when the outcome of the Nazi seizure of power was still being contested in the German courts and the German streets. It closed when the regime was collapsing, when the artillery of the advancing American army could be heard from within the wire, when the SS guards were making personal calculations about survival, and some of them were already shedding their uniforms and disappearing into the Bavarian countryside. 12 years is a long time for any institution. It is an extraordinary length of time for an institution of this particular kind, long enough to become, in its own terrible way, established, normalized, and self-sustaining. What Dachau left behind is not a single, simple legacy. It is a series of overlapping and sometimes contradictory inheritances, each of which deserves its own consideration. The most immediate inheritance is the documented record of suffering and death. More than 200,000 human beings processed through this one facility and its satellite network. The 40,000 and more documented deaths. The survivors who carried Dachau with them for the rest of their lives in ways that their families and descendants carry still. This is the most direct inheritance, and it belongs first and most completely to the individuals and families who experienced it. Any other form of legacy, legal, political, cultural, educational, must begin by acknowledging this one and insisting on its priority. The second inheritance is institutional and legal. The Nuremberg Code produced directly in response to what Dachau's medical experiment records documented, stands as the foundational document of modern research ethics, the framework within which every subsequent code of medical and scientific ethics has been developed, debated, and refined. The principle of voluntary, informed consent, which the code articulated in direct response to the absolute negation of consent that the Dachau experiments represented, is now embedded in the regulatory frameworks of every developed country's medical research establishment. It is not merely a historical document. It is a living legal and ethical instrument, invoked in research ethics reviews today, cited in legal proceedings, taught in medical schools. Its origin in the worst documented violation of its principles is the historical reality that gives it both its specific content and its moral weight. The third inheritance is political and legal in a different register. The development of international criminal law, the Nuremberg trials, taken in their full scope, and drawing on the evidence accumulated at Dachau and across the broader camp system, established the legal principle that individuals bear criminal responsibility for crimes against humanity and war crimes, even when those crimes were committed under the authority of a state and in accordance with the state's laws. This principle, contested at the time, refined in the decades since, became the foundation for the international criminal tribunals established for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda in the 1990s, and for the Permanent International Criminal Court established under the Rome Statute of 1998. The genealogy of international criminal justice runs directly through the proceedings that Dachau's evidence helped make possible. The fourth inheritance is historiographical. Dachau produced, through the combination of the SS administrative records that survived, the American military documentation created at liberation, the trial records generated by the subsequent proceedings, and the survivor testimonies accumulated over decades by memorial institutions and oral history projects, one of the most extensively documented histories of institutional crime in human existence. Historians working on Dachau today have access to a volume and variety of source material that would have been unimaginable to researchers in most other historical fields. This documentation has enabled a level of scholarly precision about how the camp system worked, how decisions were made, how authority flowed, how ordinary people became perpetrators, how prisoners survived or did not survive. That has contributed significantly to the broader historical and social scientific understanding of authoritarianism, genocide, and institutional violence. The fifth inheritance is the one that is perhaps most difficult to articulate clearly, because it lives not in documents or legal instruments, but in the shared understanding of what human institutions are capable of producing. Dachau demonstrated, in specific, documented, operational detail, that a modern state with functioning bureaucracy, trained administrative personnel, professional medical staff, and the cooperation of private industry could construct and operate a system for the systematic degradation, exploitation, and killing of human beings on an industrial scale. This was not, before 1933, a demonstrated fact of modern civilization. After Dachau, after the entire system of which Dachau was the template and the origin, it was. The question that this demonstration raises is not historical. It is permanent, recurring, and addressed to every political generation in turn. Under what conditions does this become possible again? And what are the obligations of citizens and institutions to prevent it? The scholars who have studied Dachau and the broader Nazi perpetrator apparatus most closely, Christopher Browning on the ordinary men who became killers, Hannah Arendt on the bureaucratic dimensions of evil, Zygmunt Bauman on modernity and the Holocaust, James Waller on the social psychology of atrocity, have each, in different disciplinary languages, grappled with the same underlying question. How did this happen? And what does the answer tell us about human nature and human institutions more generally? None of them produced a single complete answer. The evidence resists single answers, but the collective body of scholarship they and their contemporaries and successors have produced constitutes a serious, sustained, intellectual engagement with the question of how ordinary institutional and social processes can, under specific conditions, generate extraordinary evil. That engagement is itself a form of inheritance from Dachau. There is a specific dimension of Dachau's legacy that I want to address directly, because it is one that the historical literature sometimes sidesteps in the interest of institutional tidiness. The perpetrators of what occurred at Dachau were not, for the most part, people who came from outside German society and imposed terror upon it from above. They were people who had been produced by German families, German schools, German churches, German professional institutions. Theodor Eick was a former army paymaster. The SS guards who administered the roll calls and carried out the punishments were men with mothers and fathers, and in many cases, wives and children. The doctors who conducted the experiments were credentialed professionals who had trained in German universities. The industrial managers who negotiated for prisoner labor were businessmen operating within the norms of their professional culture. This observation is not offered as exculpation. It is offered as a warning. The capacity for this kind of participation is not located outside ordinary human experience. It is located within it, activated by specific conditions and specific institutional permissions. The question of what those conditions are, what the combination of political, ideological, social, and institutional factors is that enables ordinary people to participate in or acquiesce to systematic atrocity, is one that historians, social psychologists, and political scientists have approached from multiple angles. The authoritarian personality, the dynamics of obedience to authority, the role of bureaucratic diffusion of responsibility, the function of ideological dehumanization. All of these analytical frameworks illuminate partial dimensions of the question without exhausting it. What the specific history of Dachau adds to these frameworks is granularity. The particular organizational details of how the system was built, how it recruited and trained its personnel, how it managed the psychological costs of participation, and how it sustained itself across 12 years and through the multiple political and military contexts that Germany passed through in that period. Granularity is not the same as explanation, but it is the material from which honest explanation must be built. The survivors of Dachau, those who walked out through the gate on and after the 29th of April, 1945, or who were found in the subcamps and on the march routes by advancing Allied forces, carried the camp with them in ways that only they could fully know. Some of them wrote about it. Some testified at trials. Some returned to countries that had been transformed by the war and occupied by the same regime that had imprisoned them, and rebuilt lives under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. Some emigrated to Israel, to the United States, to South America, to wherever the post-war world offered the possibility of a new beginning. Some were silent for years, or for the rest of their lives, because the experience resisted the forms of language that the world around them offered. The diversity of survivor responses to survival is itself historically important. A reminder that there was no single experience of Dachau, no uniform response to what was done there, no collective script for what liberation and its aftermath required of the people who had endured it. There is finally the question of what this documentary, this long engagement with the history of one camp over one 12-year period in one town in southern Bavaria can actually accomplish. I have no illusion that watching or listening to 4 hours of narrative history changes the world in any dramatic sense. What I believe And what the effort of making a documentary of this kind is built upon is something more modest and more sustainable than that. I believe that knowing specifically what happened, not in abstraction, not in the generalized language of atrocity or evil, but in the specific operational details of how a camp was built, how its regulations were written, how its prisoner population was managed, how its medical experiments were conducted, how its subcamps were established, and its prisoner labor was sold, how it was liberated, how it was tried and commemorated and debated. That specific knowledge does something that general knowledge does not. It makes denial harder. It makes forgetting less available. It makes the historical obligation of memory something that can be met not through sentiment alone, but through the sustained effort of informed attention. Dachau was the first. It was the template. And the history of what it was, in all its documented, operational specificity, belongs to everyone who inherits the world it helped to shape. The gate, the town, and what remains stand at the gate one more time. It is early morning in Dachau, a spring morning, the kind of morning that this part of Bavaria does well, with clear light coming in low over the flat land to the east, and the air carrying the residual cold of a Bavarian night. The town is waking up. Shopkeepers are opening. Children are walking to school. The ordinary rhythms of a functioning German municipality are moving through the streets as they have been moving, in one form or another, for centuries before anyone thought to build a concentration camp here. The gate is still there, the replica of the original now preserved within glass in the documentation center. The words are still readable from where you stand. Arbeit macht frei. They were a lie when they were forged. They are a lie now, preserved in metal as evidence of the specific content of the lie that was told here for 12 years. The preservation of the lie as evidence is itself an argument against forgetting, against the comfortable distance that the passage of time provides, against the temptation to let the specific become general, and the general become abstract, and the abstract become inert. More than 200,000 people came through this gate, and the gates of the satellite camps that Dachau administered. More than 40,000 of them did not leave. The ones who left carried the camp with them, in their bodies, in their memories, in the ways that extreme experience restructures a human personality permanently and irreversibly. Their children and grandchildren carry something of it still, in the ways that historical trauma transmits across generations, through family silence, through the gaps in the narrative, through the things that were never explained and never needed to be, because they were never spoken. The town of Dachau carries it too, not uniformly, not always visibly, but persistently. It is a town whose name became, in the second half of the 20th century, a word that people said carefully, a word that carried its history in its syllables. The artists who came here for the light in the 19th century could not have imagined what the 20th century would do with the name they associated with landscape and clarity. The residents of the contemporary town, the 25th of May, 2026, Dachau, is a functioning Bavarian municipality of more than 40,000 people. Live with that history as a permanent feature of their civic identity, one that they have engaged with in various ways since the first post-war generation began asking questions. What remains at Dachau in the end is not primarily the physical structure, the preserved Jewelhouse, the documentation center, the foundations of the demolished barracks outlined in the gravel of the compound. What remains is the record, the administrative documents that the SS generated with meticulous clerical efficiency, the prisoner registration files, the punishment records, the medical experiment reports introduced at Nuremberg, the survivor testimonies accumulated across 8 decades of oral history work, the photographs taken by American military photographers on the 29th of April, 1945, and in the days that followed, the trial transcripts, the memorial site's research publications, the scholarly monographs, the films, the accounts of priests who survived the clergy barracks and wrote about what they found there, the letters written by prisoners to families outside the wire, censored and abbreviated, and yet somehow still carrying the compressed weight of what could not be said. This is the archive of Dachau. It is imperfect, gaps in the record, documents destroyed, testimonies that contradict each other on details, moments of historical ambiguity that resist resolution. But it is, by any reasonable standard of historical evidence, sufficient. Sufficient to establish what happened. Sufficient to establish how it happened. Sufficient to establish who bore responsibility. Sufficient to ensure that anyone who engages with it honestly arrives at the same broad conclusions, not because the record demands particular emotional or political response, but because the facts it documents point in a direction that is not ambiguous. The first Nazi camp, the template, the origin of a system that, in its full scale, produced suffering that the human mind struggles to contain in any adequate framework. Dachau was all of that. And it was also, before any of that, a town near Munich where painters came for the light. Both things are true. The coexistence of those two truths, the pastoral and the catastrophic, the ordinary and the monstrous, the town that existed before the camp and continued to exist after it, is part of what makes Dachau's history so persistently difficult and so persistently necessary to engage with. It does not let you separate the horror from the ordinary human world that produced it and surrounded it. It insists on their adjacency, and that insistence is, in the end, the most important thing it has to teach. This documentary has drawn throughout on the archival and scholarly record. The primary sources consulted include the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Holocaust Encyclopedia documentation on Dachau, the research publications of the KZ Gedenkstätte Dachau, the National World War II Museum's scholarly articles on the camp, the trial records of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, and the subsequent Dachau Military Tribunal proceedings, the PBS Nova documentation on the Dachau medical experiments, the United States Army's documentation of the 45th Infantry Division's liberation of the camp, and the published accounts of Dachau survivors, most notably Father Jean Bernard's post-war testimony. No names, dates, statistics, or documentary references have been invented. Where the historical record contains genuine uncertainty, that uncertainty has been stated rather than resolved by invention.